What's up guys, Asian here again with another PTS video, and this is probably going to be the last PTS video for the next week or so. That's just because as of PTS patch 4.3.4, there were no real major changes to any sort of balance changes. The main things were they changed a couple of things with the final bosses on the new dungeons. None of which really affect, sort of class balance, racial balance, and things like that. That does not mean that there won't be any changes between 4.3.4 and when Wrathstone goes live next week. But for this particular week, there's really not that much testing that I can do that will really shed any new light to anything that hasn't already been done in 4.3.3. So this next week is pretty much only going to be build videos for builds that are probably not going to be affected too much by the Wrathstone changes, as well as just me testing out a couple of last few ideas for new meta build setups taken from asking people around in toxic rating environment and from my own testing. So that's probably gonna be the next couple of videos this week. Probably won't be every single day. It'll probably be every other day, at least until Wrathstone is released, at which point all of the meta builds will be coming out, one for each day. So this last video is going to be taking a look at Acuity on a stamina Khajiit. Specifically, we're doing this on a Nightblade just because you do get the additional crit damage as a Nightblade using the Shadow Mundus. So this was a request by Alastair Holligan. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly on YouTube. And the idea behind this is with Mechanical Acuity, you have that 100% crit chance, and then when you have the new crit damage passive from the Khajiits added on with the shadow damage plus Nightblade damage and all that, the idea is that those two things combined, the 100% crit chance with the very, very high crit damage, that'll end up beating out or coming close to matching the current meta, which is Advancing Yokeda with Relequen and Velidreth. So basically what I did was I basically tested things out. The only thing I changed out was this front bar set. I did test out a new CP setup and Mundus setup for the Relequen and Advancing Yokeda parse. Part of it is to keep things consistent between the Advancing Yokeda parse and the Mechanical Acuity parse, but the other thing that I was taking a look at was this new CP setup and trait setup that was recommended by people in toxic rating environment that might end up being a little bit better compared to the current idea, which is running the Lover Azure Mundus Stone. So in terms of gear, we basically went all mediums, Velidreth as our monster helm, Relequens as our body, and these pretty much remain exactly the same. All the vines, all stamina enchants. You're pretty much your bread and butter for stamina DPS. What we changed was the jewelry and the weapons. So we changed out Mechanical Acuity for Advancing Yokeda. The jewelry was always bloodthirsty. We always had weapon damage enchants on the jewelry. And then for our weapons, we had 2 daggers on the front bar here. We had Nirn and Sharpened, and this again is a change that was made, recommended by somebody in toxic rating environment by a few people that were testing a couple of things on stamina DPS. They recommended going with the Sharpened offhand, adding a lot more points into piercing, and then running the Shadow Mundus. That's kind of what I did here. So we did Sharpened, Poison Damage Enchant, and Nirn Absorb Stamina Enchant. You still want the Nirn on the main hand, and then on your Maelstrom Bow back bar, we still had Infused Weapon Damage Enchant. So the main changes here between the Lover Mundus is this Sharpened offhand with a lot more points into piercing. So what I mean by that is, I need to change this up because I was doing some Magicka tests earlier today. But basically what you're doing is you're basically going to be giving up a bunch of CPs here and there. If I can remember exactly what I got here. So here is more or less what you're going to be looking at here. Believe this was it. So this was the CP setup that I ended up using, and again, this was a recommendation by, I believe it was the Gentle Chew, Tor, and a couple of other people in toxic rating environment were doing some tests with, I believe it was Stamina Warden mostly, but these CPs can pretty much be translated across all different classes. But the idea is You're going to be dropping the lever as your Mundus. You're going to be picking up the Shadow as your Mundus. You're going to put a lot of points into piercing here, 62, which does mean you're going to be dropping down Might to 64, Precise Strikes to 56, Dullmeters to 48, Mastered Arms to 48. And the idea behind here is that you can run the lever. You can run the Shadow. You still have piercing to kind of make up for the loss of penetration from the lever, along with that Sharpened offhand. So that's kind of the idea here. And so this was the CP setup that I ended up using for these tests. So again, the only thing I changed out here was this front bar set. So I did use Advancing Yokeda. Again, all bloodthirsty, all weapon damage. The only thing I swapped out was that front bar set. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look here at the numbers themselves. The numbers were pretty much exactly what I anticipated. So here is the ability metrics comparison that I tested out here. So with all of our raid buffs up, set combo 1 is Advancing Yokeda, set combo 2 is Mechanical Acuity, and we end up seeing about a 2.65% difference in favor of Advancing Yokeda. And then when we go over to our parses here, that's pretty close to what played out here. So Acuity is on the left, Advancing Yokeda is on the right. So Acuity pulled 52.3k with a higher variance compared to the Advancing Yokeda parses. The Advancing Yokeda pulled almost 54k with about half as much standard variance here. So we have 552 as our standard deviation for Acuity, which kind of makes sense. It's still going to be a proc set versus Advancing Yokeda, which you can pretty much maintain almost 100% uptime as long as you're paying attention to when you're bar swapping and things like that. So the standard deviation here is much smaller, 228 compared to the 552 on an Acuity, because Acuity in the end is still a proc set, and this difference in averages does end up to be about 3.1% DPS difference on a solo self buff test. Again, the ability metrics combo here is with raid buffs, so 2.65 here. So a little bit higher here on the solo self bust. The gap does close a little bit according to the ability metrics, so this is a little bit higher, but again, ability metrics is not exactly a one-to-one comparison to DPS, but this pretty much fell in line with what I was expecting to see in terms of mathematics, that Advancing Yokeda would pull out ahead. And if we go ahead and take a look at the actual comparisons here, you can actually see why. So average crit chance here is 80% with crit damage modifier. This is on an orc, so I just tested out on an orc, is 1.17. If we did decide to use a Khajiit instead, so if we went Khajiit, not that, that's food, Khajiit, and then we add in that extra 10% here, our crit modifier is 1.936. Now, the thing with running Mechanical Acuity versus something like Advancing Yokeda is you do lose out on crit chance. So even though Acuity is guaranteed crits, it doesn't have full uptime. So it's 5 seconds every 18 seconds. So you're going to get overall a lower crit chance overall. So that does end up kind of reducing your crit modifier a little bit. So the crit modifier here was 1.936. Crit modifier here is about 1.86. And when you add in the Shadow here, it becomes almost 2% here for the Advancing Yokeda, versus the 2.88 here with the Advancing this is with Acuity. So about 2 with Acuity and 2.088 for Advancing Yokeda, and that's just because of the higher crit chance. You do have a higher average crit chance with Advancing Yokeda compared to with Acuity, because again, it is a proc set, it doesn't last the entire time, versus Advancing Yokeda, which you can pretty much maintain very good uptimes on, as long as you're kind of mindful of when you need to swap to kind of maintain your Advancing Yokeda procs. So that's basically what it boils down to. It's just the fact that you have higher crit chance with Advancing Yokeda on average than you do with Mechanical Acuity. Of course, this might not necessarily translate into raids, just because Acuity is a proc set, so you don't necessarily have to stand in the front bar in order to get your proc, or I should say your Advancing Yokeda. So Advancing Yokeda is dependent on being able to maintain those stacks. So if you're not really able to maintain those stacks, and there are a few fights in the game where it might be a little bit more difficult, if you're for some reason you're playing Stamina in Cloud Rest, for example, it might be more difficult to maintain your Advancing Yokeda stacks. Basically any fight where you might end up losing Relequen stacks, typically speaking, Advancing Yokeda is not going to be quite as strong. But for most fights in the game, Advancing Yokeda is going to be fairly easy to maintain, and you will end up getting overall a higher crit chance on average running Advancing Yokeda compared to Acuity. So even though the idea is sound, it's very dependent on how well you're able to maintain your crit chance with Advancing Yokeda. Now that being said, if it's a choice between something like Acuity front bar versus War Machine front bar or Briarheart front bar, then Acuity would probably end up doing a little bit better just because you do get a little bit of additional crit chance there. And that might outweigh the additional weapon damage you get from Briarheart potentially. So there is that caveat there. So Acuity is not necessarily a bad set, it's just not going to be the best set if you're looking to pull out as much DPS as you can. It is a perfectly fine set to run kind of as you're trying to farm up Advancing Yokeda or you're trying to buy up Briarheart or something like that. So that is a potential option to kind of fill in your one of your sets while you're kind of farming for your best in slot sets there. So that is it for this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.